Ned Jarrett carried a secret for more than 70 years, and the death of Gentleman Ned means the last man who lived it is finally gone. This is the story of a bond between two of NASCAR's founding families that ran so deep, so long, and so quietly that most fans never fully understood what they were watching. When Ned Jarrett passed away peacefully at his home in Newton, North Carolina on June 4th at the age of 93, the racing world lost more than a two-time champion. It lost the final living thread connecting the Jarretts and the Earnhardts, two families so intertwined that they named their sons after each other, raised their children side by side, and shared a bond so deep that it spilled out, raw and unguarded, on live national television during the most famous final lap in Daytona 500 history. And here's the part most fans never knew. Dale Earnhardt Jr., the man who carried both family legacies into the modern era whether he wanted to or not, has spent years quietly confirming what the old-timers in Newton and Kannapolis always whispered. The Earnhardts and the Jarretts weren't rivals who learned to respect each other. They were something much closer to one family wearing two last names. Stay with me because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why a simple 8-word sentence that Dale Earnhardt spoke to Ned Jarrett in the spring of 1993 might be the most important thing the Intimidator ever said. And why, in the span of just 18 days this spring, NASCAR buried two champions and left Dale Jr. holding the weight of all of it. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what was lost on June 4th, you have to understand what was built in the red clay of North Carolina 75 years ago. Ned Jarrett was born on October 12, 1932, in Newton, North Carolina. Sawmill country, hard country, the kind of place where a man's word and a man's work were the only two currencies that mattered. His father, Homer Jarrett, ran the family sawmill and farm, and he had plans for his boy. Those plans did not include race cars. Racing in the late 1940s was something done by bootleggers and roughnecks, men with skinned knuckles and bad reputations. It was no place, Homer figured, for a Jarrett. But Ned had already fallen. He'd been to the dirt tracks. He'd heard the engines, and so young Ned Jarrett did something that tells you everything about the quiet steel underneath that gentlemanly exterior. He raced anyway, in secret. He drove under a borrowed name so word wouldn't get back to his father, slipping off to the local dirt ovals while the family believed he was somewhere else entirely. Think about that. The man who would one day be called the most polished gentleman in the history of stock car racing started his career with an alias, sneaking around like one of the moonshiners he was racing against. Eventually, of course, his father found out. And here's the thing about Homer Jarrett. When he realized his son was not just racing but winning, the resistance softened. If a Jarrett was going to be out there, he was going to do it right, under his own name, with his own people in his corner. And it was out there, on those Carolina bull rings in the 1950s, that Ned Jarrett met the man who would change his life. A lean, hard-eyed dirt tracker out of Kannapolis with a reputation for being absolutely impossible to beat on a short track. His name was Ralph Earnhardt. Now, if that last name just made you sit up, good. Because this is where the story stops being about one man and becomes the story of two families. Ralph Earnhardt was, by nearly every account from drivers of that era, one of the toughest and smartest race car drivers who ever lived. He was a master mechanic, a tactician, a man who could nurse a car all night and then pounce on the last lap like he'd been toying with the field the whole time. They called him Ironheart, and the man earned it. In 1956, Ralph Earnhardt won the NASCAR Sportsman National Championship, proof that on his level, against his competition, he was simply the best there was. He would later be named one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers, a canonical honor that confirmed what the Carolina short track community had always known. Other drivers of that era told the same story about Ralph for decades afterward. He wouldn't show you his hand all night. He'd ride behind you lap after lap, saving his tires, saving his equipment, letting you think you had him, and then, with the laps winding down, that car would appear in your mirror like a bad dream, and there was nothing you could do about it. He built his own engines, set up his own cars, and outthought the field before he ever outran it. And for years on those dusty ovals across the Carolinas, the man standing between Ralph Earnhardt and the checkered flag was very often Ned Jarrett. They were rivals in the purest sense. They banged fenders, they stole wins from each other. There were nights Ned drove home furious at Ralph, and nights Ralph drove home furious at Ned. But here is the part that made them different from every other rivalry of that rough-and-tumble era. When the engines shut off, they were best friends. Not friendly competitors, not respectful acquaintances, best friends. Ned would later describe Ralph as his closest pal in racing, the rival he measured himself against and the man he trusted most. And the bond went so much deeper than the two men. Their wives, and you cannot make this up, were both named Martha. Martha Ruth Bowman Jarrett and Martha Earnhardt. The two Marthas became inseparable, while their husbands traded paint on Saturday nights. The Marthas sat together in the stands, raised their babies together, and held each other through the fear that every racing wife of that era knew. The fear that one night, the man you loved wouldn't come home from the track. The families traveled together. They ate together. They celebrated together. And when the Jarretts were expecting a son, the Earnhardts hosted the baby shower. Let me say that again because it's the detail that defines this entire story. The Earnhardt family threw the baby shower for the Jarrett family, and running around at that shower was Ralph's own little boy, a 5-year-old with his daddy's eyes, named Dale Earnhardt. And what did Ned and Martha Jarrett name the baby boy they were celebrating that day? They named him Dale. Dale Jarrett, two families, two Marthas, two Dales, one bond. Now before you think this was all sweetness, let me give you the story that proves these were real men with real tempers, because the legend of that baby shower has a sharp edge to it. Shortly before the shower, Ralph had done what Ralph did. He'd bumped Ned out of the way on the track to take a win. Rattled his cage, moved him, took the trophy, and Ned was hot about it. So hot, in fact, that when the night of the shower came, Ned drove Martha over to the Earnhardt place, dropped her off at the door, and refused to go inside. The future Hall of Famer, the man they'd call Gentleman Ned, sat out in the parking area and stewed in his car the entire evening rather than shake Ralph Earnhardt's hand. That's not a story about hatred. That's a story about brothers. Because only somebody you love like family can make you that mad. And only family is still family the next morning. The friendship survived the bump, like it survived every bump, and the two households kept growing up side by side. While Ralph stayed close to home, dominating the short tracks and stacking up wins where the money was steady, Ned took the leap into NASCAR's elite Grand National Division, what we now call the Cup Series. And the way he financed that leap has become one of the most legendary gambles in the history of American motorsports. In 1959, Ned wanted a winning Ford that was up for sale for $2,000, money he did not have. So on a Friday afternoon, after the banks had closed, Ned Jarrett wrote 2 checks for $1,000 each, knowing full well there was nothing behind them, and knowing the seller couldn't cash them until Monday morning. Then he took that car out over the weekend and did the only thing that could save him. He won, twice. 2 races in 2 days, and the prize money covered the checks before they ever bounced. Gentleman Ned, the most honorable man in racing, launched his championship career on a pair of hot checks and 48 hours of sheer nerve. If that doesn't tell you what was burning underneath that calm Carolina smile, nothing will. The gamble paid off in full. In 1961, Ned Jarrett won his first championship. Then in 1965, driving for car owner Bondi Long, he delivered one of the most dominant seasons the sport has ever seen, winning 13 races on his way to a second title. And in that 1965 season came the win that still stands as a monument, the Southern 500 at Darlington, the toughest, meanest track in the South. The track too tough to tame, the place that chewed up champions and spit them out against the wall. That brutal September afternoon, cars fell apart all around him in the Carolina heat, and Ned just kept rolling, smooth and patient and untouchable, until he had lapped the entire field many times over. When the checkered flag finally fell, Ned Jarrett had won by a margin of 14 laps, 19.25 miles, the largest margin of victory in NASCAR Cup Series history, a record that has stood for over 60 years and will almost certainly never be broken. By the time he hung up his helmet, Ned Jarrett had 50 wins in 352 starts and 2 championships. And then he did something nobody does. At just 34 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, he walked away. Ned Jarrett retired as the reigning defending series champion. And to this day, he remains the only driver in NASCAR history to retire while holding the crown. He went out on top because he'd promised himself, and his Martha, that racing would not take him from his family the way it took so many men of that generation. And this is where Ned's story takes the turn that would make him a legend twice over. The shy sawmill kid, and he truly was painfully shy by his own admission, had taken a Dale Carnegie public speaking course during his driving days, originally just to handle trophy presentations and sponsor dinners without his knees shaking. That little course changed American sports broadcasting, because Ned Jarrett took that trained, warm, honey and gravel Carolina voice into the radio booth, and then the television booth, and became the voice that taught millions of Americans how to love stock car racing. For decades, when NASCAR came on CBS or ESPN, Ned Jarrett was the man explaining it to you like a trusted uncle leaning over from the next chair. He never talked down to the audience and never talked over them. He could explain a crossover move or a tire strategy to a first-time viewer without ever insulting the lifer sitting next to them. And that gift, that patient, decent, welcoming voice carried the sport out of the Southern fairgrounds and into living rooms from Maine to California. There are millions of fans alive today, maybe some of you watching right now, who can honestly say Ned Jarrett is the reason they fell in love with racing. The man won 50 races as a driver, and somehow that might be the third most important thing he ever did. Meanwhile, back in Kannapolis, the Earnhardt side of this story was unfolding in a much harder key. Ralph Earnhardt never got the national glory his talent deserved. He kept grinding the short tracks, kept winning, kept providing, until September of 1973, when his heart gave out while he worked on a race car at home. He was just 45 years old. Ned Jarrett lost his best friend. Martha lost her Martha's husband. And a 22-year-old high school dropout named Dale Earnhardt lost the father he'd spent his whole young life trying to impress, before he ever got the chance to show him what he'd become. Those who knew Dale Earnhardt best always said that wound never fully closed. He carried his father's death like fuel. Every championship, every trophy, every defiant, fender-banging victory was, in some way, a message sent to a man who wasn't there to receive it. Dale Earnhardt would go on to be named one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers himself, father and son on the same list, a testament to what that Kannapolis bloodline produced. But the trophy that mattered most, the one Ralph never got to see, kept slipping away. And who was watching that angry young man claw his way up from nothing? Watching with the eyes of a man who had loved his daddy like a brother. Ned Jarrett. Ned, who had hung up the microphone-free life and become the sport's most beloved broadcaster, now found himself calling races starring his best friend's son. Imagine that for a moment. Every time Dale Earnhardt muscled that black car to the front, the man describing it to America was the man who'd been at his daddy's side in the dirt track days, the man whose wife had thrown the family's baby shower. And at the very same time, Ned's own boy, the other Dale, the one celebrated at that shower, was rising too. Dale Jarrett, the baby of that story, grew into a Cup Series driver himself, fighting through years of mid-pack rides, trying to prove that the second-generation Jarrett belonged. He was chasing something that only one other family in NASCAR history had ever achieved, a Cup championship for both father and son. Lee Petty had won the championship, and his son Richard Petty had become the king of NASCAR with 7 titles. The Pettys were the only father-son Cup champions before the Jarretts. Dale Jarrett was trying to make his family the second. That context is everything. Which brings us finally to February 14, 1993, Valentine's Day, the Daytona 500, and the single most beautiful, most heartbreaking conflict of interest in the history of sports television. Here was the picture coming to the final laps. Out front, the black number 3 of Dale Earnhardt, the most dominant force in the sport, a 5-time champion at that point, and yet a man cursed at this one race. The Daytona 500 was the only crown jewel that kept slipping through Dale Earnhardt's fingers, year after agonizing year. He had lost it every way a man can lose a race. And now, in 1993, he was once again leading late, once again within sight of the one trophy that haunted him. And chasing him down, in the green Interstate Battery Chevrolet, was Dale Jarrett, Ned's boy, running the race of his life, closing in on the back bumper of the Intimidator with the laps running out. Up in the CBS broadcast booth sat Ned Jarrett, watching his son hunt down his best friend's son for the biggest prize in American motorsports. The Dale and Dale Show, that's what it became, live in front of millions. And as the white flag flew, the the CBS producer made a decision that broadcast schools will study forever. He came into Ned's headset and essentially told him, "Forget objectivity. Be a dad. Call your son home." What happened next is one of the most replayed pieces of audio in racing history. Ned Jarrett, the consummate professional, the gentleman who had spent decades calling races straight down the middle, threw away the rulebook on live television. As the two cars thundered off turn 4 for the final time, Ned openly, joyfully, unapologetically rooted his boy past Dale Earnhardt. He told the audience exactly who he was pulling for. He talked his son down the back straightaway, urged him to keep that car low, willed him toward the line, his voice cracking with everything a father feels. And as the green Chevrolet flashed under the checkered flag, Gentleman Ned shouted to the world that Dale Jarrett was going to win the Daytona 500. His son had just won the biggest race on earth, and Ned Jarrett had called it, not as a broadcaster but as a daddy. To this day, fans simply call it the Dale and Dale Show, and it is widely considered one of the greatest moments ever aired in motorsports. But here's the part of the story the casual fans never learned. The part that happened a week later, away from the cameras in the garage area at Rockingham. And it's the part that explains everything about who these families were to each other. Ned Jarrett was a man of old-school honor, and that call had been eating at him, because in his joy for his son he had openly rooted against the other driver. And the other driver wasn't just anybody. It was Ralph's boy. It was Dale Earnhardt, the man whose heartbreak at Daytona was already the stuff of legend, denied that trophy yet again, this time with his late father's best friend cheering against him on national TV. So at Rockingham the following week, Ned sought out Dale Earnhardt and apologized, face to face. He told him he was sorry for being so partial on the air, that it wasn't professional, that Dale deserved better from him. And Dale Earnhardt, the intimidator, the man in black, the hardest man in the sport, looked at Ned Jarrett and smiled, and he said 8 words. "Don't forget, Ned, I'm a father too." Let that sink in. The man who had just lost the Daytona 500 again, to that man's son, was telling him there was nothing to forgive. Because Dale Earnhardt understood exactly what Ned's voice was doing in that booth. It was doing what Ralph Earnhardt never got the chance to do for him. Ralph died before he ever saw his Dale win anything that mattered on the national stage. There was no father in a broadcast booth for Dale Earnhardt, no daddy's voice calling him home. And rather than resent the sound of it, Dale Earnhardt honored it, because the bond between those two families was bigger than a trophy. It always had been, going all the way back to 2 Marthas in the grandstands and a baby shower in Kannapolis. If this story stopped right there, it would already be one of the most beautiful in sports history. But it doesn't stop there, because Daytona wasn't finished with these families, not even close, and neither was Dale Jarrett. That 1993 win wasn't a fluke, it was the beginning. Ned's boy went on to win the Daytona 500 2 more times, in 1996 and again in 2000, becoming one of the rare 3-time winners of the great American race. And in 1999, Dale Jarrett climbed the final mountain and won the NASCAR Cup Series championship, meaning Ned Jarrett got to live the dream that was stolen from Ralph Earnhardt. He got to watch his son become a champion, just like his daddy. The Jarretts had done it, father and son Cup champions, only the second family in NASCAR history to achieve it, following in the footsteps of Lee Petty and Richard Petty. 2 championships for the father, 1 for the son, and eventually a place for each of them in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Ned inducted in 2011, Dale in 2014. One of the precious few father-son pairs ever enshrined together in the sports cathedral. Everything Homer Jarrett feared racing would do to his family, it did the opposite. It made the Jarrett name immortal. But Daytona, as always, demanded its balance. 5 years later, in 1998, on his 20th try, Dale Earnhardt finally won the Daytona 500. The curse broke. Every crew member from every team lined pit road to slap his hand as the Black 3 rolled by, one of the most emotional scenes the sport has ever produced. And there to share in it, still behind the microphone, was Ned Jarrett, openly overjoyed for Ralph's boy, calling it one of the happiest days he'd ever had in racing. The man he'd apologized to at Rockingham finally had his trophy, and nobody outside the Earnhardt family celebrated harder than the Jarretts. And then came 2001. The same race, the same track, the final lap of the Daytona 500, with Dale Earnhardt running third behind his own two cars, protecting the win for his team, and in an instant, in turn 4, he was gone. The sport's towering figure, Ralph's boy, the man who said "I'm a father too," killed on the last lap of the race that defined his life. And here is the cruelty of the symmetry that haunts everyone who knows this story. The greatest moment these two families ever shared came off turn 4 at Daytona on a final lap, a father's voice rising with joy. And the worst moment came off that very same turn, on that very same final lap, 8 years later. The same patch of asphalt gave this story its happiest chapter and its most devastating one. The Jarrett family grieved that day not as competitors, not as colleagues, but as what they had always been, the other half of one extended racing family that had now lost both of its Earnhardt patriarchs far, far too soon. Ralph at 45, Dale at 49, two generations of Earnhardt men, neither one allowed to grow old, while the Jarretts were left to carry the memories for both houses. And no one carried more of it than Ned, who had now outlived his best friend by decades and his best friend's son by what would become a quarter century. Which brings us to the man left carrying all of it, Dale Earnhardt Jr. Think about what Jr. inherited. Not just the most famous name in racing, he inherited the whole tangled, beautiful weight of this story. The grandfather he barely got to know, the father the world took from him on live television, and the Jarrett family woven through every chapter of both their lives. Junior was 26 years old when his father died at Daytona, almost the exact same age his father had been when Ralph's heart gave out in that Kannapolis garage. Two Earnhardt sons, a generation apart, both forced to finish becoming men without the fathers who made them. If you've ever wondered why Dale Jr. speaks about family history with that particular quiet ache in his voice, that's why. He knows the cost of this story better than anyone alive, and Jr. has spent his entire adult life quietly tending that legacy in ways that most fans see but never fully connect. Start with the number. When Dale Jr. burst into the Cup Series and became the most popular driver in America, he did it in the red number 8. And that 8 was never random, never just a sponsor's choice. The number 8 was Ralph Earnhardt's number, his grandfather's number from those Carolina short tracks where Ralph won his 1959 and 1960 limited sportsman championships, where he and Ned Jarrett waged their wars and built their friendship. Every time that red 8 took the track, it was a tribute to the very era where this whole story began. Jr. has said it plainly over the years on his own podcast, The Dale Jr. Download. The history matters to him. The grandfather he lost, the father he lost, the old short track world they came from. He has built a career after driving, his broadcasting, his podcast, his race team, substantially around preserving exactly the history we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. The man has made himself the keeper of the flame, whether he ever asked for that job or not. And this spring, the Flamekeeper's job got unbearably heavy. Because in the span of 18 days, NASCAR lost 2 champions, and both losses ran straight through Dale Earnhardt Jr. On May 21st of this year, the racing world was rocked by the death of Kyle Busch, a 2-time Cup champion, one of the most talented and polarizing drivers of his generation, after pneumonia turned to sepsis and took him with brutal speed. 63 Cup wins, champion in 2015 and 2019, a man who could drive absolutely anything with wheels on it, and who spent 20 years making half the grandstands boo and the other half roar, which, if you know your history, is exactly what they used to say about a certain man in a black number 3. The tributes poured in from every corner of the sport, from drivers who raced him, drivers who hated racing him, and drivers who grew up wanting to be him. But it was Dale Jr. who delivered the detail that broke every fan's heart. On his podcast in the days after, Jr. revealed the final text message Kyle Busch had sent him. And what did one of the greatest drivers of the modern era want in one of his final messages? He wanted to run the Dale Jr. 8, the throwback car in Jr.'s Cars Tour, the car carrying that same number 8 that traces all the way back to Ralph Earnhardt's dirt track days. One champion's last wish, sent to the keeper of the flame, asking to drive a piece of the very history this video is about. You want to talk about the weight of a legacy? That text is the weight of a legacy. The sport was still wearing black for Kyle Busch. Tribute decals were still on the cars. And then, before NASCAR could even catch its breath, just 14 days later, came June 4th. The news out of Newton, North Carolina. Ned Jarrett, Gentleman Ned, the last living giant of NASCAR's founding generation, had passed away peacefully of natural causes at his home, at 93 years old. The oldest living champion. The last man who raced against Ralph Earnhardt as an equal and loved him as a brother. Gone. NASCAR's leadership said it perfectly in the official tribute, noting that behind that calm demeanor, Gentleman Ned was as fierce a competitor as the sport has ever seen and an outstanding ambassador for more than 6 decades. Both things were true at once. That was always the magic of Ned Jarrett. The iron and the velvet in one man. Now, let's be careful and honest with each other here, because this channel respects you too much to do what some channels do. Dale Earnhardt Jr. has not staged some dramatic press conference about Ned Jarrett, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you something. What Jr. has done is bigger and quieter than that. Through years of his own words, on his podcast, in his broadcasting, in the way he's preserved his grandfather's number and his family's history. Jr. has confirmed the thing the old-timers always said, and the record now makes undeniable. The Earnhardts and the Jarretts were never really rivals. They were two families fused into one story. The proof was never hiding. It was sitting right there in plain sight the whole time. In a baby shower in Kannapolis, in two boys named Dale, in a father's voice cracking on national television, in 8 words spoken in a garage at Rockingham, and in a number 8 that a dying champion asked to drive one last time this spring. So as Father's Day approaches, the first Father's Day the sport will spend without Gentleman Ned, maybe the best way to understand what was lost on June 4th is to put the whole 75-year story in a single frame. A sawmill kid sneaks off to race under a fake name, and a hard man from Kannapolis becomes his greatest rival and his best friend. Their wives share a name and a sisterhood. Their families share baby showers and grief. One friend dies young, at 45, working on a race car, and never sees what his son becomes. The other friend lives long enough to see everything, to call his own son home to a Daytona 500 win with the whole world listening, to apologize for loving too loudly, and to be forgiven with the 8 most graceful words a grieving rival ever spoke. He lives long enough to watch his best friend's son finally conquer Daytona, and long enough to mourn him when Daytona takes him back. He lives long enough to watch his own boy become a champion, joining Lee Petty and Richard Petty as only the second father-son pair to win the Cup, and to stand beside him in the Hall of Fame. And he lives long enough, 93 years, to become the final witness, the last man standing from the era when all of this began. The last man on Earth who could close his eyes and still hear Ralph Earnhardt's engine on a Carolina dirt track because he was the one chasing it. Don't forget, Ned, I'm a father too. Dale Earnhardt said that in 1993. And in the end, that one sentence is the entire story of these two families, fathers and sons, the Jarretts and the Earnhardts, Ralph and Ned, Dale and Dale, and now Dale Jr., the last keeper of the flame, carrying a number 8 and a mountain of memory into a future where, for the first time in NASCAR's entire existence, none of the founding fathers remain to watch over it. Ned Jarrett didn't just live the history of NASCAR. He was the history of NASCAR. And the bond he shared with the Earnhardt family, the bond we all suspected and now fully understand, might just be the most human story this sport ever produced. Rest easy, Gentleman Ned. Tell Ralph the boys turned out all right. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, do us a favor, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps stories like this one find the older race fans who lived through these years and deserve to remember them. Subscribe and ring the bell because this is part 2 of our Ned Jarrett series and we are not done. If you missed part 1 on the secrets Ned revealed about the 1993 Daytona 500 before he died, it's on the screen right now and you owe it to yourself to watch it. And drop a comment below telling us where you were when the Dale and Dale show happened, or your favorite Ned Jarrett broadcast memory, because this community's stories are the best part of this channel. Thank you for watching and we'll see you in the next one.